There's been much discussion lately about the debate between Ken Ham of the Creation Museum and Bill Nye of Bill Nye the Science Guy. And to be perfectly honest, I have not been able to bring myself to actually watch the debate, probably because I am still bitter at the Creation Museum for not letting me ride the Triceratops. In case you missed my video on the Creation Museum, in which I visited it with a few other YouTubers, there is a link in the description. Tell me I'm too old to ride the Triceratops. At any rate, I did, however, watch the pre- and post-debate discussion amongst YouTubers and others about how the debate went, about whether or not Bill Nye even should debate Ken Ham. And in that discussion came up tactics. Is it a good idea for Bill Nye to debate Ken Ham? And there are pros and cons on both sides. But I started thinking about atheist tactics in general, non-believer, skeptic, whatever label it goes under, the sort of person who would actually want to debate a creationist, whatever label you want to put on that. And to be honest, in the last less than a decade, although it's been nearly a decade now if you really stop and think about it, there's been an emergence in the mainstream of atheist secular voices, most prominently people called the Four Horsemen: Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Dan Dennett. Although Dan Dennett was never really that popular, so I don't know why he gets that much credit. At any rate, those people set a tone and set talking points, which influenced a lot of people. Let's just be honest. They were tone setters for the public debate and discussion that followed. And what came out of that was often a distortion of that tone, because they were very strident and very critical, and some people distorted that to the point where it became intellectual snobbery, condescension, and mockery. Now, of course, I'm sure some of you would say, well, wait a minute, actually, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens could be all of those things. And I'm not denying that in certain times they were all of those things, which is what I'm getting at. They set a tone, which was a way of approaching these issues. Now, if we were just all computers and it was just a matter of input, facts to program the brain to believe the correct thing, then things like tone wouldn't really matter. Approach wouldn't really matter. It would just be all about the information, the facts. But that's not really the way people worked. One thing that I have come to realize about the so-called Four Horsemen New Atheists is that, generally speaking, they sort of lack insight into the question of why people believe what they believe. They're good at identifying what they believe. They're good at identifying the consequences of those beliefs. But in a way, that's sort of the low-hanging fruit. And it's kind of facile to just constantly attack the negative consequences. If you want to understand why they believe what they believe, that's often a separate matter, but it's often crucial to how you engage with someone. So if you actually believe that mocking and condescending to someone about their beliefs will make them change their mind, then I don't think psychology is really on your side, but you can try it. And a lot of people honestly do. So, going back to the debate with Bill Nye, it would seem, from the pieces that I've seen, pretty clearly laid out his point of view, and maybe he hopefully gave a glimpse into the reality of science for people who were otherwise shut off from it, and they can see beyond the facade that's been put up that told them that scientists are all evil secularists who just want to deny God and hate kittens and so forth. And maybe they'll start to question their overall worldview, but they're probably not going to just automatically flip and change their mind. But it's not nearly as counterproductive as something like mockery is. Some people often feel justified in mocking or adopting a kind of intellectual superiority, but more likely than not, it's going to cause people to double down on their beliefs and fuels people's persecution complex. Because when dealing with people like fundamentalist Christians, they often have a serious persecution complex at the core of their belief that sustains them. It gives them the culture war that they're looking for. It gives something to point to rally around, to be against. And the two sides end up feeding off of each other. So for the end of this video, I'm going to play some clips by the author Chris Hedges, who wrote a book called American Fascists, who, in my opinion, it's a much superior book than the so-called Four Horsemen's books, because it actually, even if he's wrong, offers some insights into the psychology of fundamentalists, creationists, and so forth. In his opinion, the engine of the movement, as he says, is personal and economic despair. So you have people who feel betrayed by the world, their lives are in shambles, and they retreat into a non-reality based worldview that's a kind of fantasy that psychologically sustains them. And the clips that I'll play will explain it in more detail. But when you think about it that way, let's assume that his premise is true. And I personally find it, in my experience, quite an appealing hypothesis, to be honest. And I want all of your thoughts in the comments section. But if his hypothesis is true, then where does that leave tactically dealing with fundamentalists and creationists? If going for what seems like the obvious thing, the facts, the logic, the science, if that is at best only part of the story, then how do you deal with these people on a more personal psychological level that doesn't just cause them to further retreat into their own fantasy world? And how might we approach the entire issue in a less counterproductive way? So give me your thoughts in the comment section. Have a nice day.
The question is whether I feel encouraged by the midterm elections. Certainly it's encouraging. For me, the engine of the movement is personal and economic despair. And that's the engine of all totalitarian movements. That's not an original thought. Fritz Stern wrote about this in The Politics of Cultural Despair. Hannah Arendt wrote about this in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Karl Popper understood this. And what we have done over the last few decades is disenfranchise tens of millions of people in this country. There's been a Weimarization of the American working class, many of whom come from my own family, where they can no longer get jobs which can sustain them in a dignified and meaningful way. And you go to some of the former manufacturing centers, as I have over the last 2 years, in places like Ohio, and the end of the world is no longer an abstraction to these people. And the disintegration of community has brought with it the social ills, the disintegration of family, addictions, domestic abuse, schools that no longer function, coupled, of course, with a removal of any kind of credible or meaningful federal assistance. And I blame much of that on the Clinton administration. And we are left in a situation where there is no check on the creation of a rapacious American oligarchy. We now live in a country where the top 1% of this nation controls more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. And when you create those kind of economic dislocations, when you shunt these people aside, and they're largely invisible now in press that is controlled by these corporations, the result is political deformation, political distortions, which is exactly what the Christian right is. Because what the Christian right does is it removes them from a reality-based world. It gives them a non-reality-based belief system that gives them a belief system in magic, where Jesus intervenes on a daily basis in their life, where God has a plan for them, where they are protected, supported. And once you remove, and we're talking about tens of millions of people in this country, once you remove this number of people from a reality-based world, and that, of course, is what creationism is about. It's not about an alternative. It is about the destruction of science. Facts become interchangeable with opinions. Lies become true. Facts that are inconvenient are simply discarded and ignored. And that, of course, is the very definition, as George Orwell understood, of how a totalitarian society works. And the first thing totalitarian movements do is they remove their believers, from the reality-based world by conjuring up a lying world of consistency until they have the power to shut those iron gates and impose that world on the rest of us. And there is no hope to blunting this movement until we step in and re-enfranchise these people back into the society. This is a movement built on profound despair. And it is a despair, unfortunately, we as citizens have sat by complacently and allowed to happen. But when people live in a non-reality-based world, when they believe that dinosaurs existed with Adam and Eve. I was at the $25 million Creation Museum in Kentucky, which I think is opening in a couple weeks. And, they have a replica of the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve are naked, but they're turned in such a way that you can't see breasts or anything. And they have dinosaurs there, and visitors are explained that in the Garden of Eden, dinosaurs were safe because they only ate plants, including T-Rex, and the reason he had long teeth is so he could open coconuts. This is all real. And that it was only after the fall that dinosaurs became meat eaters. There was a replica of Noah's Ark, and of course that thorny question of how you fit dinosaurs on an ark. And that was solved because Noah only put baby dinosaurs on the ark. I mean, when you get down to that kind of level, you realize the absolute absurdity of the belief system. But while it's absurd, that's all these people have. And part of the rage that they feel towards critics comes from this fear of being pushed back in the reality-based world in which they could not cope, the world that betrayed them, the world that they yearn to be destroyed. And that's essentially what this obsession with apocalyptic violence is. It is about destroying the world that betrayed them, along with all of the people who betrayed them.